Thank you. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Good evening. My name is Noelle Bonner. I'm the CEO of Bonner Communications and Vice President of Events and member of the board of the United Democratic Club. I really want to thank you all for joining us for this important discussion on police reform on the 1-month anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. The United Democratic Club felt it was important to not only create a forum for conversation and change around police reform in the wake of the deaths of so many Black Americans at the hands of law enforcement, but we realized that there's truly a lack of understanding and historical context for how racism, a system of oppression, contributes to the devastation that we see in Black communities all over this country. Police brutality, while historically one of the deadliest forms of violence against Black people, is just one of the many ways in which the lives and livelihoods of Black people continue to be destabilized, disrespected, and disregarded at all levels of society. So our hope is that our new Race Talk series will bring important dialogue around race, racism, and prejudice and their impact on public policy, the criminal justice system, and government to the forefront, so we can begin to confront these issues head on. So again, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank my fellow board members on UDC. I want to thank all of our members for being here and new faces that are joining us tonight. I want to thank our incredible panel for, as soon as we reached out, committing to joining this conversation. A couple housekeeping items. If you haven't joined the club, please go to uniteddems.org. It's only $20. We do a lot of incredible work for candidates, for elected officials, and around public policy and advocacy work in the city. We are live tweeting this event at United Dem Club SF, and we would love to have you join our club. So without further ado, this event is Race Talks, Police Reform in San Francisco. What can our city really expect and what can it? And so I'd like to introduce our panel. Chief of the San Francisco Police Department, Bill Scott, San Francisco Supervisor, District 10, Shamann Walton, San Francisco District Attorney, Chesa Botidin, Commissioner of the San Francisco Police Commission, Dion-Jay Brookter, and Founder and Executive Director of Healing for Our Families and Our Nation, Mattie Scott. So I'd like to invite each of our panelists, starting with Bill Scott, to just give a 1 to 2 minute introduction, just a little bit about who you are and your role as chief in each of your roles in your positions.
Thank you, Noelle. First of all, thanks for having us on this panel. Very important topics that we're talking about tonight. So as you said, I'm the Chief of Police of the San Francisco Police Department. Been here with SFPD now for 3.5 years. Prior to coming to San Francisco, I spent 27 years with the Los Angeles Police Department, where I left there as a deputy chief of police. In terms of reform, having left a department in LAPD that went through a similar reform process back in the early 2000s with a consent decree, actually, I spent over half of my career, about half of my career in the LAPD, I'm sorry, working through a very vigorous reform process. So I understand the work really well, and I also understand how challenging reform can be. And we have a lot of work in front of us with the San Francisco Police Department. In 2016, before I got here, the city and the department voluntarily engaged in the Collaborative Reform Initiative, which was at the time being administered by the United States Department of Justice. In 2017, with the new presidential administration, that reform initiative was basically done away with. And myself and at the time the mayor, after Mayor Lee died, Mark Farrell, who was the mayor for about 6 months, decided to re-engage on our own volition with this process, with the California Department of Justice being our third-party independent oversight entity, and also with Hillard Hines, a contractor that the US DOJ used. And the reason I bring that up is it shows that we are in this city committed to police reform. We were before the incident with Mr. Floyd. We've had our series of very tragic incidents as well. And that reform initiative, although we have a long way to go, we have had some successes. So I'll end it there. And I know there will be a lot of questions and discussions about that, but we are already within a reform model that we believe is a good model to actually incorporate a lot of what's coming our way in terms of some of the recommended reforms that we're hearing from around the country as well as locally. So thanks for having us.
Thank you. We'll move to Supervisor Walton for just a brief introduction.
Thank you so much, Noelle, and thank you to United Democratic Club for holding this important forum. Just as you stated, asking the question about what do we feel our role is, for me, it's really to make sure that I fight to put policy and laws in place that will make sure that these things don't happen again, that we don't lose another unarmed Black man, another unarmed person of color to law enforcement with no accountability and no consequences as well. So one, we're going to prevent this from happening and push policies that will keep us safe and community. But two, also make sure that if something like this does happen, there's a level of accountability, just like any individual that makes a mistake. So looking forward to this discussion and this conversation.
Thank you, Supervisor Walton. DA Boudin, if you would like to just give a brief introduction.
Thank you, Noelle, and thanks to the club for bringing us all together. There's never been a more important time than right now when it comes to racial justice, when it comes to the fight against white supremacy, and when it comes to identifying ways we can make the criminal justice system more just, and we can root out the racism and discrimination and inequities that we all know have plagued the administration of justice in this country since the days of slavery. You know, it is not for nothing that Michelle Alexander's seminal book, The New Jim Crow, was able to trace in horrific detail the legal structures and institutions that transformed from slavery into Jim Crow, into the criminal justice system that we still see around us today in many ways. We've come a long way, and yet we have much further to go. Let's not forget that the majority of this country's history, slavery or Jim Crow, were legal institutions, and they are deeply embedded culturally still in many of our institutions. So as district attorney, my job is to help keep San Francisco safe. And I know that we can't do that. We cannot keep San Francisco safe for all San Franciscans unless we have equity, unless we have equal enforcement of the law, unless we have relationships between law enforcement and communities, especially communities where there is a high prevalence of guns and gun violence, unless we build trust, unless we figure out ways to break down the discrimination and the over-policing and the over-prosecution and figure out how to actually invest our resources in things that prevent crime, that rehabilitate people who commit crime, and that lift up victims who've been injured by crime and prioritize healing and restoration, not just punishment.
Thank you. Commissioner Brookter.
Yes, as everyone's kind of stated, I want to make sure that I thank Noelle and everybody at UDC. So I have a very interesting lens, I think, coming into this conversation. As I was looking at the flyer, I probably have the longest title, right? Being an executive director out here in community, making sure that we're uplifting our community and looking at public safety, but also the lens of a San Francisco Police Commissioner, one of 7, who is a body that provides oversight of the police department, working alongside the chief to change policies within the department, but to also hold the department accountable. And I think on the community side, being in this space and being in this place, to also be a community voice, but also a community bridge to help educate the community about the commission, what its role is as a body, inviting folks out to meetings so that they really understand the process and what it is as we provide this oversight for the department and also the Department of Police Accountability. So really looking forward to the discussion.
And Ms. Scott, would you like to just close out the introduction?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here. My name is Mattie Scott. I'm the founder of Healing for Our Families and Our Nation and the chapter leader for San Francisco Mothers in Charge, which is a national chapter of mothers, grandmothers, and wives all over the country, and the San Francisco Brady, California state president. It's so good to be here, and thank you for inviting us to CDC and for all of you being on this panel. As a 20-year veteran in this city and as a mother first, who lost my son to gun violence and watch other mothers lose their sons to gun violence, not just in the neighborhood, but also by police shootings. I bring to the table a voice of hope, a voice of education, a voice of community, working with law enforcement, working with the DA's office and all of the entities that serve our community. That is the goal, to educate and to bridge the gap, so that we can all come to the table and come up with the best blueprint so that lives could be saved. Because at the end of the day, I want my son to come home and my grandson to come home, but also I want the officer to go home to his family as well. That's what we want to do, because we want to stop the killing and start the healing, because this is about all of us or none of us. We have to dismantle this bias culture that has been in this country for over the last 200 years. We have to realize how this country embraced African Americans. We came here as slaves. We did not come here as immigrants. We came here as slaves. So that's number one. And so we have to remember, in the beginning, police were role and duty was to catch slaves, runaway slaves. So that in itself, we have to be honest about and talk about it and pull down those bias things that happen and come to the table to make things work, because we all have to live here and work here in the community. So we all have to do it together. We can't do it in silos, because as I said, it's about all of us at the end of the day. It's about all of us or none of us. And so my goal is to educate the community, educate and empower mothers and fathers whose children are faced with this deadly thing of their children being murdered in the street by police officers or by children in the neighborhood. Okay, so we have a double jeopardy that we have to deal with, not just police shootings, but everyday shootings by community violence. So it's about, like I said, the education, the communication, building those relationships and bridging the gaps so that we can save lives. That is the ultimate goal, and bring down this racist bias that have crippled our nation. It is time that we address it and talk about it and not sit it aside. So thank you.
Thank you. So I want to kick off with a question to the entire panel. The video of George Floyd being killed by former officer Derek Chauvin has ignited a wave of protests in the United States and around the world, with people demanding accountability from law enforcement for the treatment of Black Americans, and acknowledging that George Floyd was not the first Black American whose murder at the hands of law enforcement was recorded on video. What do you think was truly about this police murder caught on tape?
Well, I think for me, it was very painful to see. It was very painful to see an officer with his knee on someone's neck for over 2 minutes. That for me is definitely has to change. That is police brutality. That is murder, in my opinion, because you're sent out to protect and serve. And for his other officers to sit around and let him do it was even more devastating for all of us who had to witness that. All of us parents, everybody around the world. As you can see, this has ignited a world movement. And you don't usually get to see something like that happening. Usually someone would thank God for cell phones. That's all I have to say. And thank God for the young lady who videotaped that. We're making sure that she gets the trauma and the services that she needs, because this really impacted her heavily, and the community. I remember when Kenneth Hardy Jr. was shot in Bayview, and all of the mothers was getting off the bus, and it was in the evening, he'd gotten off the train, and to see that murder, to see him on the ground like that, and for all of us to witness his death still impacts me till today. To see all of our elders, all of our kids, everybody, it was broad daylight, he had from a transfer evasion, so that brought that back up for me, that regurgitated that back up for me, regurgitated for me Matthew Johnson's killing here in San Francisco when I was a teenager for stealing a car in Hunters Point. He was shot in the back, running from the police and he was shot in the back. So it brings up a lot of things. And it says that it's time, America, it's time for us to really address this issue, really pinpoint what needs to be done, working with the police, working with the community, working with the DA's offices, all of us at the table, because that's the only way we're going to pull this ugly demon down. It's the only way.
I would say the big thing for me is just the disregard of Black lives. The fact that someone to put their knee on someone's neck for over 8 minutes and also be taunting the cameras and sitting there with their hands in their pocket, just disregard for Black lives. And I know that no one does anything like that unless they feel there's no consequence to their action. And so it's not the first time we've seen that. It's being captured on camera more and more now. But these things have continued to happen, and the complete disregard for Black lives is what we need to focus on changing. And the last thing I would just say is, another thing that's disgusting is that this particular officer had over a dozen complaints of excessive force, misconduct, and other improprieties, and was still able to remain on the force. And I'll talk a little bit more. I know DA Boudin and I will talk a little bit more about some things that we're proposing, but the fact that you can do something like that with the complete disregard of Black lives, and I haven't watched the whole video because I can't at this point, and the fact that this ignorant human being was still able to remain in law enforcement after all of the ended up leading to someone's death is something we cannot continue to let happen.
Yeah, I absolutely concur with that, Supervisor Walton. I mean, the maliciousness, the disregard is just undaunting. And I think from a police commission standpoint, I can say in terms of policies, our use of force policy and looking at our DGO 5.01 and having the duty to intervene and having policy set in place, it really is mind-boggling that other departments across the nation haven't been able to catch up to the speed or duration that we have as a police department and as a city, although we know there's a very, very long way to go. But that was the first thing that we did when this came about, was look at our policy. And we said, what is our policy as a department, and what do we have to make sure something like this does not ever happen? Now, we had something that did come out in January, and Chief has addressed that, and we're continuously going through, looking at what's transpired, but looking at those policies that folks have to even think that there may be a disregard for the policies that are set in place. But making sure, I mean, we've been to marches, and I've been a part of protests where we've actually had to kneel for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And I can't tell you how many times I had to switch knees, I had to wobble out. So to even think or understand that as a human being, and I don't know if this individual is a human being, but that you can put your knee on someone's neck while they go lifeless is absolutely disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. So, and I know we're going to talk about more, Noelle, and I mean, I'm just very, very passionate about it, but I can definitely say, us looking at our use of force policy, our DGO 5.0, 5.01, being able to look at what we actually tell our officers, because as far as I was concerned as well too, is how are those officers that were there that didn't stop this individual from that happening, what happens to that individual? As far as I'm concerned, you're just as guilty as the individual that had the knee on the neck, because you have a duty as an officer to intervene when someone's using a use of force that can take someone's life.
Definitely. Does anyone else want to comment on this one before we move on? Okay.
I'll just say briefly that I think, I want to echo the comments that Dion-Jay and Commissioner Brookter and Supervisor Walton made. I also want to say, I think there's something, we have seen a lot of killings, and we have seen too many killings, right? And, I think Mattie made this point really well. It's not just police killings. There's a general disregard and devaluation of the bodies and of the lives of people of color, especially young Black men in this country. And it's deeply ingrained in our culture. It's ingrained in our institutions. It's ingrained in the way that media reports on these things, and it's ingrained in the way that police these communities. So in some ways you could say, well, we had Ahmaud Arbery and we had Breonna Taylor and we had Tony McDade and now we've had Rashard Brooks, and what was different about George Floyd? And I think that's in many ways your question, because we know that these killings are not new. And we know that they've, since time immemorial, they've been brutal, they've been violent, they've been shameless, they've been brazen. A lot of folks said, we talk about reform. And we talk about, well, what can we do? What reforms can we make? A lot of folks said, well, if we have body-worn camera footage, if police are wearing cameras, they'll police themselves. They will know that what they're doing is being recorded and they will adjust their behavior accordingly. That was a conversation we had 4 or 5 years ago. And one of the things that was so shocking about this video, people of color know this has been happening. People who are woke, people who've been paying attention, people who've been allies, they know that this is not new. But a lot of folks didn't know and didn't believe that it was this brazen. And even folks who knew what was happening before, I think many of us, maybe naively, expected that when they're on video, when they know they're being videoed, they won't do that. It will cause them to adjust their behavior. And this video was not just intimate and personal. It wasn't the kind of distance that comes when you shoot somebody, no matter how many times. This was hands and knees committing a prolonged murder of someone who was lying face down on the ground, handcuffed, begging for his mother with his last living breath. And the person who committed that murder was staring at the camera like he didn't care, didn't have a care in the world. And I think as Supervisor, I'm sorry?
And didn't feel like he would face anything.
Exactly, impunity. There's a culture, not just of racism, but also where people are taught that they can get away with murder, even if it's on video, even if it's brazen. And he would have gotten away with it, but for the tremendous social uprising that we saw across this country. And I think it's continued, and we've seen it grow and sustain itself, both because of how deep-seated the anger and the racism is and how long it's been tolerated by people who never should have had to tolerate it in the first place. And also because of the way that the President of the United States has responded, adding fuel to the fire, putting out white supremacist slogans and signs in his campaign videos, disrespecting the sanctity of human life, encouraging racism, encouraging use of violence by police, and frankly, because of the way that the police across this country have responded. In 98 cities, they used tear gas on peaceful protesters. I'm proud to say that wasn't what happened here in San Francisco, but across the country from coast to coast, peaceful protests were met with tear gas, with billy clubs, with violence at the hands of police, which is exactly what's leading to the protests and why they're so sustained.
Yeah, I would just echo what everybody has said here, but I think one of the things that I will add that made this so gut-wrenching is you watched a human being, another human being, die over the course of 8 minutes on video, and then to hear Mr. Floyd call for his mom. I mean, if that doesn't touch your heart, what does? And I think just that alone, I think really tugged on people's hearts. And I mean, everything everybody said, I agree with, and I echo that. It begs the question of whether or not that officer, if he had on his camera, I believe he did, whether he even had the consciousness that all police officers should have for the sanctity of life. And that's more than just a coin phrase. When we talk about sanctity of life, you're talking about another human being that we all got to see, unfortunately, have the life choked out of him as he's calling for his mother, who's been dead for 2 years. And if that didn't touch your heart, then you don't have a heart.
Great. Thank you. Well, Chief Scott, I'm going to start with you with my first question here. America is being forced to reckon with aspects of its history that has gone to great lengths to suppress, particularly when it comes to law enforcement. For example, the origins of modern day police departments are remnants of both Northern white watch groups that maintain public order by policing prostitution and drinking, and Southern slave patrols whose main functions were to catch runaway slaves and discipline them on plantations. Knowing the history of how police are about in this country, being a Black chief of the San Francisco Police Department that does have a history of officer-involved shooting, how does the city begin to heal? And what can we expect going forward when an officer is involved in what the community believes is police brutality or murder?
Noelle, you broke up on the last part of your question.
I'm sorry, I said, what can we expect going forward when an officer is involved in what the community believes is police brutality or murder?
Great. Yeah. So I'll start with the first part of your question and statement about the history of policing in our country. I mean, here's our reality. That history is well documented. You know, as you mentioned, slave patrols in the South, police were used as a form of social control in many cities. They were really tools of, elected officials and politicians, and there was a lot of corruption in early policing. And in some cases, there still is corruption in policing. But here's one of the things that's profound. Now we as a profession are to the point where these things are being acknowledged. And acknowledgement is a big step, because it wasn't too long ago where those things weren't even acknowledged publicly. I can recall within the last 10 years where a public official at a policing conference made some statements acknowledging everything that you just said and everything that I just said. And this person was criticized heavily for just acknowledging that. So I say that to say, when you look at reconciliation and you look at truth and reconciliation, and the first step of that is acknowledgement. We have to acknowledge our past, and we have to acknowledge that policing has not been kind, particularly to Black people in this country. I'm a part of this profession, and I'm happy to be a part of this profession, but there's an acknowledgement that has to happen. That has to be followed with change, real change and action that's real. Acknowledging it and continuing to do the same things is not going to work for anybody. So that acknowledgement has to be followed up with change. So to the last part of your question is, what does that look like in this city, in this country, and in this city? Supervisor Walton mentioned it. The calls for accountability are as loud as they have ever been. But what's happening with the calls for accountability, at least in this state and in this city, legislation is being put forth to force the issue. It's no longer going to be left up to us to do it if we want to or we feel like it. When I say us, I mean us in policing. Legislation is being put forth to force the issue. And I welcome that, and I think it's a good thing. In 2019 in our state, we had transparency laws that were passed. Now things that weren't disclosable publicly 2 years ago now are. I know Supervisor Walton is heading some legislative efforts in our city, but that accountability has to be real, and that change has to be real. It can't just be slogans and words and people saying things that make us feel good to get through the moment. It has to be real, and we all share in making that happen. I have a big responsibility in that, as does everybody on this call, because we all, I think, have a piece of what needs to happen, and it has to be led by transparency. Things that are transparent, that are brought to light, I think they breed accountability. So it has to be real, it has to be led by transparency, and it's got to happen quickly.
Thank you. District Attorney Boudin. A district attorney is the top law enforcement official in each county, and their office brings charges against and accused for the people, making the role vitally important. But as we saw in the case of George Floyd with the Minneapolis District Attorney Mike Freeman, he was seemingly not prepared to charge Derek Chauvin, Tu Thao, Thomas Lane, and J. Alexander Kueng with any crimes associated with the murder of George Floyd. And in the case of Breonna Taylor, the Louisville District Attorney's Office has not brought any charges against her killers. Because the District Attorney's Office works hand in hand with the police department on cases of all kinds, with police officers serving as investigators, how will you ensure that when cops kill innocent people, the appropriate charges are brought against them so they can be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law?
So we have a MOU in San Francisco. It's a little bit different than the way it works in some jurisdictions. We have a internal investigation bureau, IIB, And that's a unit within my office that has its own investigators, its own lawyers, its own paralegals that reports directly to me. And we have an MOU, a memorandum of understanding with the police department that allows our investigators to show up on scene of any officer involved shooting and do their own investigation. Now, obviously the police department has about 10 times our budget, and they are always going to be the first one on scene by definition if it's a police involved shooting. But the MOU, as it's worked so far this year, I'm happy to say we haven't needed to use it many times, and we hope it stays that way. But in the few instances, it's worked well. We've been notified immediately. Our investigators and lawyers have been able to arrive on scene, do their own investigation, speak with witnesses, speak with officers, get their own evidence from the scene. And it's that kind of independence that I think the public needs. You know, Chief Scott talked about the need for, you know, the need for transparency if we're going to have any progress towards building trust. And I think a lot of the people that I talk to in the community are saying, well, how can we trust the police to police themselves? And the answer is we shouldn't have to, right? We want to be able to trust the police, but we shouldn't have to trust them to police themselves when it comes to something as serious as the kind of cases we're talking about. And that's where having an independent investigation team that can do its own evaluation of the evidence comes in. Now, there's a bigger problem, I think, from the standpoint of those folks who want to see more prosecutions of police who use violence or use force. And that is the state of the law. The law allows police to do a lot of things, or makes it impossible to convict them for doing a lot of things that any one of us not wearing a uniform would be charged and prosecuted successfully for. That's a political decision. That's something we need to talk about at the state level. If we want to make it easier for prosecutors to secure criminal convictions against police, the state law has to change. And there was a new law that took effect on that exact issue this year. Assembly Bill 392 took effect in January. As far as I'm aware, there has yet to be a single trial anywhere in the state of California where that new law is put to a jury and where we get to see how judges and juries apply that law to police who use force. Many of us thought that the law should have been stronger. In its original form, it was, and it got watered down after police unions got involved in the negotiations in the legislative process. So I think we need independence, we need transparency, and we need laws that hold police to at least the same standard that the rest of us are held to. And right now, the laws often hold police to a much lower standard, give them more protection in terms of their personnel files than any of us get, give them more protection in terms of use of force than any of us get. I think we need to at least level the playing field.
Agree. Supervisor Walton, over to you. As the supervisor of District 10, where the majority of African Americans in San Francisco live, what would you like San Franciscans that live outside of the district to understand about how policing historically has operated in Black and brown communities versus white communities? What police reforms on the table do you believe will be the most impactful to the District 10 community to heal the wounds related to police brutality?
Well, thank you for the question. And the first thing I would say for folks who live outside of District 10 and outside of Black communities as a whole is they have to understand the history of this country. And you know, we can talk about the focus of exterminating Black men for hundreds of years here in the United States. Going back to slavery, where they wouldn't let us reproduce, they wouldn't let us learn. Going to segregation, not only did they not want us to reproduce and let us learn, but they tried to keep us away from wealth, then to mass incarceration, which still continues to this day. And then, of course, allowing us to be exterminated and being killed by law enforcement without consequence. And so I would say to folks who don't live in Black communities, who've never been policed the same way, you have to understand that what we're talking about is real. Racism and law enforcement is real. It's been real for a long time. It's now starting to get captured on camera. But the other thing I would say to folks who aren't in our communities and who don't get policed the same way is, we appreciate you protesting and standing with us, particularly after something has happened. But this fight for us is 365 days of the year. I say it all the time. I'm Black every day. I don't get to go to a protest, walk away, go to work, and then come back when another incident happens. We need you standing by us, standing with us, 24/7, and making sure you support the policies that we are pushing, that we say as Black people, we say as communities of color, we need to happen for some true change and some true reform. So as we talk about redirecting resources from the police department, do understand and know that when we redirect those resources and make an investment in the Black community, the most isolated and disenfranchised the community that's been continued to be oppressed for decades, particularly in this city, that also means that some of the additional opportunities you may have been provided, some of the privilege opportunities and resources you get for certain things, that means some of that may not be able to be funded at the same level, because if you really want to focus on equity, if you really want to focus on making sure we can make systemic change and provide true opportunities for successful outcomes in a Black community, then you have to sacrifice that way as well.
100% agree. Ms. Scott, I want to talk to you a little bit about, you did mention Kenneth Harding Jr., but as we know, Mario Woods was a huge case in San Francisco, I believe in 2019. And as we talked about, San Francisco does have its own history of police-involved shootings. So what reforms do you believe are paramount to ensure that communities of colors are protected from unnecessary violence from law enforcement?
I couldn't hear you clearly. Could you repeat that question?
I have some issues with sound here. Here in San Francisco, we do have cases that involve police shootings. For example, Mario Woods, Kenneth Harding Jr., and more. What reforms do you believe are paramount to ensure that communities of color are protected from unnecessary violence from law enforcement?
It's going to have to be a new day when it comes to training. Police officers right now, as the only public servants agent that, go to high school and then go to the academy, and then they carry a weapon, and then they go to work. Teachers, social workers, and everyone else have to have at least a 4 or 2 to 4 year degree to deal with the public. I think the training to become an officer is too short. I think it's too short, and the education to become an officer needs to be at least 2 years. They need to have a 2-year degree with more psychology and sociology classes and dealing with people in the public. I think that they definitely need to learn de-escalation tactics and training year round. They need to have that. To have a list here. If you look at soldiers are trained consistently in different situations and environments. Police need to reflect that ever-changing situations in their to become officers. I believe that officers that stay in the same district for years, I think that's wrong. I think every officer needs to work in every community. They need to rotate so that you can become acquainted with the TL. You can become acquainted with Bayview or Fillmore or the Mission. I think that these changes are happening in New Jersey and other places around the country because we mothers have implemented a lot of change within the departments in the nation. We've gone to them and sit at the tables and did this with Mothers in Charge in Philadelphia with former Police Commissioner Charles Ramsey. We have done a lot of work, and so we feel like a lot of things that can change to help us. Also, the rotation of officers, long training, with de-escalation tactics year-round, weight and training and consistent body training and combat training for these officers to handle different situations. I remember because of the training that when Tony Chapman was the assistant chief, a young man's life was saved because of what we did. Because of what we did, we called the family, all the police on 7th and Mission Street. His life was saved because of the tactics that were used in that situation because he suffered from mental illness. So, that didn't happen to the Miss to the ladies whose son was in the trunk of the police car, who was not a threat to anyone, and he got killed. You know, that didn't happen to him. So a lot of different things needs to happen across the board. When Elvira Polar's son was murdered, Gus Rugley, down in the Alamany area, and then she arrived on the scene, she got arrested. This is her son who was just shot 37 times by the police. And then she's the mother trying to find out what's happened, and they arrested her. Things like that have to change. Things like that have to change. You don't arrest a mother who just showed up on the scene and you just murdered her son, you know, in the car. The thing that happened to Mario Woods, you know, I was told that these were new folks on the scene. They you know, they weren't in the department for a long time. So I think that supervisors and officers that come into the Black community, that come to handle a situation, they need to be more long-term and experienced officers, and they need to be somebody that knows the community and that can engage to prevent a shooting like that from happening. They should understand someone that's doing a knife. You can see he was mentally, or you can see there was some things going on with him, you know. So they need to look at those things. Mental health treatment in our community definitely needs to be looked at, because a lot of our young people are suffering from substance abuse, bipolar disorder, and our police officers need to be able to recognize those things. They need to recognize those things, because then that would have helped prevent and save lives. So I have a long list of things that we need to do for police reform, but I don't want to take up all the time because I want to give others a chance to talk. But I definitely believe that, you know, the 2-year requirement, I think the 6 months or whatever it takes to become officers is too short. And I think they need to be more educated, particularly in mental health and other areas, and that the rotating of shifts would definitely be good, and that cultural sensitivity training be taught. You know, and I know we've done some of those with the DOJ. It was 272 reforms, and I think 40 to 60 was signed off since 4 years ago when that was implemented. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. We have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. Commissioner Brookter, I'm going to move it over to you now. As the mission of the San Francisco Police Commission is to set policy and conduct disciplinary hearings on charges of misconduct, there cannot be police reform in San Francisco without the policy directives and input from the Police Commission. What are short-term and long-term policy goals of the Commission to get the SFPD on the right track when it comes to incidents of police brutality involving Black citizens?
Well, I do want to recognize that Ms. Mattie actually stated a lot of them. So I think in terms of the Commission, and I know we're pressed for time too, Noelle, but I mean, at the very forefront, one of the things I'm really working on with my colleagues is to make sure that we're a more proactive commission. I think the reason that we are even having this call and this conversation is because of reaction to what we know is already taking place. So how do we act as a commission to be more proactive around the policies to ensure that things like this don't happen? So definitely working with the chief to get updates on the weekly around the DOJ reforms, as he kind of stated. You guys know there was 272 recommendations that came down from the Department of Justice. And I think making sure that we're transparent with the public, but also working with the department to hear weekly updates on where we are with those DOJ reforms. As we know, we need to continue to push those forward. We talked about the hiring practices, being able to look at what sort of assessments and tests do we give individuals who even want to come into the academy, let alone once they're in the academy and on the force, but also ensuring that there's ongoing training around trauma, you know, for the officers as well too, because we know that an officer, once they get inside the system, there's also that opportunity to be tainted and to become a cancer once they're inside of the system. So ensuring that there's ongoing trainings going on, as Mattie really talked about. And then also as a department, you know, we just had a meeting last week, and we talked about how do we assist as a commission to make sure that we help with some of these biases, even within our own communities. And so Commissioner Hamasaki asked for the removal of mugshots, right? I think as a community, if we go into our police departments and all you see are Black and brown folks and their mugshots of individuals who are committing crimes, that then causes something systematically even within our communities. So being able to remove that as well, again, looking at our bias training, how we're doing it early and often. And I really think just being very transparent. DA Boudin, mentioned the Senate bill, and there's another one that's out there, Senate Bill 1421, which actually allows us to be able to share records with members of the public and folks that ask for these records so that we can see what's going on. And there's legislation that's being pushed forward right now by Supervisor Walton around our footbeats, right? So being able to work with the commission and work with the chief to say, we have officers that are in our communities that know our young people by first name. They know families by their last name. And we shouldn't then, because those officers are doing a great job, pull them into headquarters. Allow those officers to be in our communities and to stay in our communities so that the community continues to be safe. And I think also diving into the data. So right now, Commissioner Damali Taylor and I are diving, or actually me and Commissioner Elias are diving into the 96A report. Now we're beginning to look at, now that we have data to say, why is it disproportionate that African Americans are being pulled over and stopped without cause versus any other race? And we need to be able to have that data so that we can have these conversations to actually change the legislation that we know needs to be changed so that we can not only just protect all of our citizens, but our Black citizens here in San Francisco.
So, I mean, the topic of training and implicit bias, particularly implicit bias training, continues to come up around not only this moment, but historically, kind of to get, law enforcement integrated around policies that will help them understand people of color better. And kind of in doing some research for this webinar, there was a CBS News kind of report around where they had reached out to about 155 police departments across the US, which included 3 of the largest cities, and according to 2010 census data. And together, all of those police departments include about 1/5 of the US population. 69% of the departments reported that they had implicit bias training, but 59% that they had no way of measuring the success or failure of the programs. And then more than 75% of the departments said that they had changed their training after controversial use of force practices. And of the departments that reported to CBS, 90% said the implicit bias training was mandatory. So while the CBS News survey did not include San Francisco, at a time when so many people are calling for this meaningful implicit bias training, how do we ensure that here in San Francisco, our training is both measurable and impactful? And this is really to the entire panel, because it seems that while police departments have these training, a lot of them have it, there's no way to really measure it. They kind of have these programs and they don't know how to track, what impact it's having, across the board.
I just want to jump in and say, and I may not be directly answering your question, but I really truly feel implicit bias is a window dressing. And I know I've done some work with folks on this very Zoom, and we talk about implicit bias training, but here's the reality. We are really dealing with some racist individuals in our law enforcement bodies. These are folks who know exactly what they're doing. They know how they feel about communities. Part of it comes from the actual training that they do get in the academy about certain neighborhoods and communities before they even step foot into any of these communities. So implicit bias is one thing, and teaching people to know about the things that they may not have been raised around, the cultures they may not have been a part of, but racism is what we're talking about. And we need anti-racist policies, anti-racist legislation, anti-racist proactivity, anti-racist interventions, because implicit bias is one thing, but the reality is we're dealing with some folks who really mean harm for people that don't look like them. We are dealing with some leaders in this country, particularly the president, that are very divisive. And we're dealing with a police officers association here in San Francisco that would rather be divisive rather than work together on how we can come up with ways to keep everyone safe. And those are the things that we're up against. So I'm sorry I didn't get specific to the question about implicit bias training, but we got to go a step further and deal with anti-racism.
Now, I want to echo what Supervisor Walton said. I think, look, training is great, and we can all use more training. All of us can use more training. But when you're dealing with a culture that is deeply embedded and centuries old of racism and of oppression and of impunity and of lack of transparency, you can't fix it with participation in implicit bias training. It's not just about implicit bias. It's about explicit bias. The words that those men said over Ahmaud Arbery's body after they shot him to death, after they hunted him and killed him, tells us we are not dealing with implicit bias. We're dealing with explicit bias. And that's true not just in Georgia. That's true in the Bayview, where Supervisor Walton represents. It's true in the Western Addition. It's true in the Mission. We have a relationship between the San Francisco Police Department Gang Task Force and our communities that is nothing short of an occupying army. You ask young men growing up in the Western Addition, you ask young men growing up in Sunnydale housing projects, how they interact with police. And they'll tell you that when they walk out the front door of their house, living in those neighborhoods, they look down the street, they see their neighbor, they see their cousin, they say hi. Just doing that, they've already met 2 of the 10 criteria listed in the SFPD training for being a member of a gang. When we have SFPD classifying people as gang members and using every single interaction that a police officer has with a young man growing up in those neighborhoods as a basis to prove in court that they're a member of a criminal street gang, we're never going to have trust, and we're never going to have equal enforcement of the law, and we're never going to be able to get past the culture of racism. So let's have training, but let's start by making real changes. Let's start by looking at ourselves long and hard in the mirror, recognizing the daily practices that we allow law enforcement. I'm not just talking about the police, I'm talking about the office that I run as well. That's why day one in my office, I said, we're not using money bail. We're not going to have people sitting in custody simply because of their poverty. That's why one of my first policy announcements was to say, we're not using gang enhancements, right? Because they're racist. And we're not going to allow these facially race neutral laws or policies to be used as justification to continue something that Michelle Alexander has traced all the way back to slavery. Not in San Francisco, not on my watch.
Well, yeah, and sorry, go ahead.
Yes, and we cannot, the thing about it is, we can do all the training we want, which is good, but we can't train racism out of people. We just can't train racism out of people. We need to screen for racist attitude and behaviors and have actions set up and implemented to remove people like that, because you're here to protect and serve. You take an oath, and if you demonstrate, I mean, I look at the officer that killed George Floyd, look at his record. What happened? Who didn't look? Somebody missed the ball. They missed the ball. He had a list of incidents, and way before George Floyd, and no one did nothing. It's ridiculous. You know, so we need to see that whole structure has to come down and has to be looked at and reevaluated so that we can, screen for racist attitudes and behaviors like that and get them off the force. They don't need to be on the force. I remember when the officers did the slamming blacks and gays. I remember that, all the texting that went on with that here in San Francisco, which was awful. And those officers were reprimanded. However, look how long it took, and it shouldn't take that long for people who are with bad behavior, bad attitudes, no matter what. If you're a teacher in the classroom and you're doing something wrong, and the parents have a meeting, you're out of there. It's no ifs, ands, or buts. So the same should be for officers who patrol our neighborhoods, patrol our communities, who's supposed to protect and serve. How else are we going to build these needed relationships? We want the police in our community. We want to be able to have relationships with them. Are all officers bad? No. But you have more bad than you have good. And that's not good across this nation as we can see it, And the only way it's going to happen is if we really create policies and changes that's going to really look at the bad behavior, jump on it right away, not wait 8-9 incidents and then look at it, nothing's done. Nothing's done to that officer. That is ridiculous. George Floyd would be alive today had they reprimanded that officer years ago for some of the bad behavior that he implemented, and nothing was ever done about it, And we have some officers here, same thing here in San Francisco and everywhere, And Chief Scott has come in and done a good job. We have a lot more work to do. He's invited us at the table. We have an African American Police Advisory Board. We need to meet more often with that Chiefs Advisory Board. We haven't met since last year, and we need to be meeting more to solve some of these unsolved homicides. Thank God for him. He did open that up and allowed us mothers who've been waiting for a long time. We have over thousands of cases that are unsolved in the city, unsolved homicide. But he did welcome us to come in and meet with him every quarter on the unsolved homicide. So we have a lot of work ahead of us, you know, and we're not saying all things are bad that's being done. There's some good things that's being done too. So I like to mention those as well as the bad. But right now, as a Supervisor Walton say, this is a race issue. This is a racism issue, and we definitely got to look at it across this nation. And I'm sure that with the right people at the table like we have and working with the community, San Francisco is the city of San Francisco, that we can get there.
Yeah, I'd like to add, you know, you know, explicit bias, racism. I mean, that's this department and most departments have explicit policies prohibiting that, but it's much more difficult than that because it's pervasive. But I want to go to your question about implicit bias, because I do think as a part of any reform effort, you know, we were prescribed when we agreed to our collaborative reform initiative to work with academic partners. And that has forced us to really look at the science of bias and the science of a lot of what we're talking about here. And those partnerships are crucial because I can tell you, I've learned more in the short time that I've been here about bias and just talking to, I mean, we have people in our own backyard, Jennifer Everhart, Jack Glaser, who are nationally renowned with this subject. And to learn from them, I know Commissioner Brookter talked about the booking photo policy. One of the reasons that it was for me that when I started talking to academics and people with PhD behind their name about this topic, to see how those simple policies impact how we think, stereotyping, who we associate with crime. There is science behind this, and we have to dig into that science as a part of our reform efforts, because traditionally, you know, a lot of our training comes from within the law enforcement community. And I'm not saying that we don't use any science at all, but we have to rely on scientists, data more. And I'll end this part with this. When I look at what has been done in other cities in the Bay Area with body-worn camera data, and Stanford did a study in the city of Oakland, great study, and they were able to develop algorithms where they were able to tell just by the algorithms who was black, who was white, just by the way officers talk to people. And you know, these are things that we can parlay into better training, better identification of things that are either biased or sometimes just racist in nature. But if you don't have the data and you don't put that data to use by letting the people that really know what they're doing have access to that data, we're doing everybody a disservice. And I'm happy to say, looking at Oakland study and what they learned in Oakland, we are engaged in a similar agreement with Stanford to look at our data in a similar way, because that's the basis to get to the root of a lot of what we're talking about. I agree, there's racism out there, we need to address it, but there's also these implicit biases that we can identify and we can train to avoiding at least stepping into the pitfall of allowing these biases to dictate how we police our communities. And we have to have these partnerships with the academic people who do this as their life's work.
And if I can just add really quickly, Noelle, to what Chief said, and just DA Boudin and Supervisor Walton and Mattie, is just understanding there's absolutely no room or no place for racism. Not in this country, not in this department. We don't want it here in this city. But one of the things that we are looking at in terms of reform, and some of my colleagues are really working on this currently, is our disciplinary matrix. How are we disciplining police officers when some of these matters come across the commission? And the more progressive we can be in our disciplinary matters, we hope to continue to try to change the culture, especially of those folks that are currently within. I think that's one of the things that we're definitely hearing. I mean, I would be remiss if I said there's a training that can train officers on how not to be racist. We would be remiss. I don't think that would be very true. But if they continue to understand,
about that a little bit because, the SF Police Commission is an oversight body for the SFPD. So when it comes to officer misconduct, how do you guarantee that transparency and honesty for the community? Because you do set those disciplinary guidelines for the police department. So what are the plans kind of going forward that and how are you going to make sure that you maintain community trust in the way that you are handling, disciplinary hearings for officers that engage in misconduct?
So I think, Mattie kind of touched on it as well too, having more advisory boards, right? So that we can actually hear from folks in community, what they're seeing on the ground. But again, that disciplinary matrix is actually something that is shared with the public as well too, when we have the meetings that are live. And folks really got to understand the process as well too. Here in San Francisco with having a police commission, most individuals think that it's the chief of police that actually discipline police officers, which isn't true. The chief makes a recommendation that actually comes forward to the commission. And the same goes for the Department of Police Accountability, which we do have in terms of another oversight body that when officers are involved with community complaints that go to DPA, they actually investigate the police department. So they're separate of the police department. And we actually have oversight of DPA as well too. So I really think a lot of it has to deal with the education piece and understanding what those tools and those outlets are that we currently do have, and how we just, again, become more proactive, tighten those up, and really, look at progressive reform, as a department and as a city.
I know we're over time, but this is such a behemoth of a topic. So I hope we can talk for another 10 minutes. And there's so many questions coming up, but unfortunately, I just don't think we're going to be able to get to them. But I do want to talk to Supervisor Walton and DA Boudin right now. You recently introduced legislation to the Civil Service Commission to prohibit the police and sheriff departments from hiring law enforcement personnel with histories of serious misconduct. Really, to me, this seems like a no-brainer. Why has this historically been such a problem for police departments, not just in San Francisco, but across the country, to adopt this, legislation around misconduct?
So I'll just jump in and there's a few problems, right? And what our resolution does, and I really, appreciate Supervisor Walton's leadership introducing it and building near unanimous consensus around that bill, around that resolution. What it does is it basically says, as a principle, San Francisco should not be hiring police or sheriff deputies who come to this jurisdiction having already engaged in serious misconduct somewhere else. And it also raises this issue, which those of us in the field know is a serious problem. It's been a problem in San Francisco in the past, of officers evading having a record of serious misconduct, evading being disciplined for serious misconduct by leaving their jobs while the investigation into misconduct is pending, or as happened in one of the recent police shootings in San Francisco, where an officer left the force literally the day before the discipline was to be imposed, and now is working, I believe, in Antioch as a police officer. So what we're trying to do is establish a high standard for the people that we trust to wear uniforms, to carry guns, and to make arrests on our streets. We're trying to have, just a basic understanding that, certain professions, whether you're a police officer or whether you're an airplane pilot, there's no margin for error. This isn't about police officers being bad or about wanting to put them in jail or anything like that. They have a very, very difficult job. And we want people who can do that job with integrity and with pride under difficult circumstances. And if there's a history of them having problems doing that, whether it be racial bias, whether it be excessive force, whether it be dishonesty, then they are not welcome to come to San Francisco and be police officers. And if they refuse to comply with an investigation into their misconduct or alleged misconduct in another jurisdiction, if they left that job and didn't comply with the investigation, then we're going to treat it as though the investigation found that they had committed that misconduct. So it's really that simple. We want the best and the brightest serving on our streets.
And to your point, Noelle, it should be common sense, and it should be written and documented as a part of policy that this is something we won't do or tolerate here in San Francisco. And there are laws at the state level. We have some of the strongest officer Bill of Rights in the state of California that have prevented certain things from being on the books. And so our hope with this resolution is that Civil Service Commission steps up and makes this policy, because if not, we will make this a charter amendment in the future. And the only reason we didn't go that route now is because we're past that timeline. But we're also doing things like redirecting resources from the police department to invest in the Black community. There is a charter that I worked on with DA Boudin and the Public Defender's Office and a lot of our advocates for Sheriff's Department oversight. So we'll have a Sheriff's Department Oversight Board and a Sheriff's Office of Inspector General that will conduct independent investigations of allegations of certain assaults and any death of our individuals who are in custody. And it's just to be, it's a testament to the sad state of affairs that we have to work on so many policies to basically, for just a lack of a better term, police our police, or police our law enforcement bodies. These are the folks that we should feel safest around. These are the folks that people should be welcoming into community, but instead we have to, as Black people and as people of color, have had to fear the very people who are supposed to protect us. And I don't say that lightly. This is not a game. And that's why we are working very aggressively to make changes, like the chief said. And I do want to say that we are fortunate to have a chief that has had to deal with reforms, and even a larger municipality. And he's someone who is willing to work with us and work through these changes. And he has a very hard job, but he understands that we are going to push for aggressive change. We're going to make aggressive change, and that you can't just continue to mistreat people of color and get away with it.
So I want to be respectful of folks' time. Again, I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to answer all the questions coming in. I have one more question for the panel here, and then we're going to close out the event. But Americans are calling on our elected officials to reimagine what public safety looks like in this country. Recently, the Minneapolis City Council voted to disband the police department, and organizers in other cities are marching to abolish or defund the police. Most of this boils down to a reallocation of public funds and resources and services in the community. Where do each of you stand on defunding, disbanding, or abolishing the police?
Well, I'll go first on that one. Yeah, I think defunding, is a broad term, and I don't believe that it's a good idea to strip police departments of their budget, because we still have a function in society. I do agree with what was said by Supervisor Walton and others on the call, that we have to reallocate resources to communities that help. And if our budget, takes a part of that, the sacrifice that it takes to do that, and ultimately we want healthy communities that hopefully at the end of all this will require less policing, because there will be less people losing their lives from gun violence. There'll be less people that are addicted to drugs if we have the right help in those communities. So, I think ultimately it's a good thing. I think we have to be thoughtful about how we do that and think through this process to do things that make sense and do things that are really workable. But I do think it's the right thing to do.
Well,
Thank you.
as you know, Mayor Breeden and I already announced that we will be redirecting resources from the police department and investing them in the Black community. It's very important to note that public safety is not about over-policing. And we have to go towards a thought process of peace officers and having folks in our communities that are there to keep us safe, but also concerned, understand, and know our communities. We have a complete District 10 community safety plan that has community-based strategies, that has community ambassadors as a whole part of this public safety system, versus just having police officers in community for enforcement, and using those resources to invest in communities to stop some of the oppression and systemic racism that exists in some of the things that have typically held our communities down is a very important part of that. And so we're going to be combing through the police department budget, seeing where we can move resources from one area to make a bigger investment in prevention, keeping people safe, and providing opportunities to improve outcomes. I could talk a long time about this subject, but I know we have other people who want to chime in, but we will continue to have this conversation. I would love to do it again, and We're having a thoughtful process with Black leadership, Black leadership in community, Black leadership in community-based organizations. Lots of forums and conversations coming up over the next couple of weeks to guide us through this budget process. And it's where to take resources, but also resources.
Well, I'm happy that that some of the money will be redirected for more community involved services, because the mothers, the majority of organizations out here, like Healing for Our Families in Our Nation, Mothers in Charge, you know, United Players, Brothers Against Guns. A lot of us have been on the front line for years and years. And, you know, it would be great to have some of the money directed toward the programs and services that we do, because we're on the front line every day. And as a matter of fact, we work with the police and the sheriff's department and law enforcement, period, over the years to help solve some of the issues that goes on in our communities to prevent violence and harm. Things would even be more disastrous had we not been on the front line, you know, helping to, you know, like SVIP and other organizations that are working hard every day to keep peace in our street when there's an incident, you know. So I don't believe in defunding the police wholeheartedly or banning the police across our nation. We need the police. We need the police in our communities. We need to have them to be the peace officers that they're supposed to be, unbiased, ready to serve and protect. When I was growing up, I remember the police officers used to help old ladies cross the street. They would come in our community and do things with us. That's the kind of officers we want. They were transparent. They knew our parents. They could go to our parents if we were getting in trouble. They could say something about one of my brothers or anybody to my dad, and they would take care of it. That's what we want. That is community policing. That's what we want. We need the police, okay? But at the same time, we need to have reform in our department that's unbiased, where there's more people of color in uniforms, particularly women, you know, and serving our communities as well. You know, that people of color in our community serving our neighborhoods, and that there should be rotation across the board so that everybody's acquainted with everybody's culture. So I'm just grateful for this panel and everyone has said, Supervisor Walton and Dion-Jay and Chief Scott and our DA. It's just been awesome. I think that we're on the right road, and I think we're going to get there together, because this is about all of us and none of us at the end of the day, and we want to stop the killing and start the healing. And all we have to do is each one reach one and teach one about everything. We teach our children about the good things about being an officer, so that they hopefully want to grow up and become a police officer. That's what we want. We want transparency across the board. Thank you.
And I'll be really brief, Noelle. So I absolutely am in agreement with what everyone was saying. And I really think it's a reallocation of funds. One, to the Black community. I think two, it's a potential to look at the budget of the San Francisco Police Department to figure out if we need to reallocate funds to some of the things that are working, right? We just had a presentation last week on our crisis intervention training. Like, how do we make sure that we have the funds there to make sure that all of our officers are CIT certified? So I think it's both. I don't think it's definitely not to defund the police, but just like any other city department, whether it's the Department of Children, Youth, and their Families, the Office of Economic and Workforce Development, the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, the police department is a city department. So to reallocate its funds to make sure that it gets into the hands of community, absolutely. And how do we reallocate funds within the department to ensure that we are putting funds towards some of the things that we know are working, into our training, into the academy, looking at how do we divert phone calls? How do we ensure that phone calls that are coming through to our 911 dispatchers are those where officers are actually needed, and it's not a call because an individual is fearful that folks are outside barbecue, that there's an issue with someone who's homeless, that has mental health issues that are outside. How do we put funding towards diverting those calls to make sure that our police officers are dealing with, you know, real matters that require law enforcement? So those are just a few of my thoughts and things that we'll be working on.
I just
All right.
briefly said that we need to invest in the strategies that are going to make us safest in the long run. And I think we depend right now very heavily on the San Francisco Police Department to help keep us safe. And that's a reality that's not going to change, in the near term, that's for sure. So we need to make sure the police are able to keep doing their job and that they're funded adequately to do it. But as with any area of government spending and use of tax dollars, we need to continually and constantly evaluate what's the most efficient and effective way to use that money. San Francisco Police Department has a budget in the neighborhood of $700 million. It's a lot of money. We have more police per capita than Oakland or Los Angeles. We have a criminal justice bureaucracy that's about 5 times bigger than it was at any period in American history until the 1980s. So is it working? Is it the most efficient? That's what we need to be doing. That's what we need to be analyzing and questioning and make sure that police are able to respond quickly and effectively to serious violent crime. That should be the priority. And ideally, we can find folks. I talk to police captains, I talk to police officers, and what I hear from them is most of their time is taken up with non-serious crimes. All day, every day, they're responding to really, really low-level calls for service. And the more we can free them up and allow them to focus their time and energy on serious violent crimes, not only are we all going to be safer, but I think we'll find ways to save money and invest that money back in the community.
Well, again, I want to thank everyone for tuning in. This has been a wonderful discussion. I know I've learned a lot. I know we didn't get to all of the questions I wanted to ask. And there's so many questions that came in from our participants here. We had about 125 folks listening in at the height of this. So I want to thank this for in. There will definitely be follow-ups as we continue to have this important discussion and understand kind of how San Francisco is keeping police reform top of mind and making sure that we are kind of reimagining public safety here in San Francisco. So again, I want to thank Chief Scott, DA Commissioner Brookter, and Ms. Scott for joining, and Supervisor Walton, who had to drop off as well. So thank you all. We appreciate you joining us for this conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Thank
night,
you
everybody.
for having us.
Yeah, great
Good
job.
night,
Noelle.
everybody.
Thank you very much. Appreciate
Okay.
it. Thanks.
Good
job.
job. Guys. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.